Welcome to Feminist Question Time on the 30th of January, 2021. Feminist Question Time is brought to you by Women's Human Rights Campaign. It's an organization, international feminist organization that promotes women's rights. It's got a main focus on defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. You can find more information on the website womensdeclaration.com, where you'll find our declaration on women's sex-based rights. The declaration has been signed by 14,272 people from 126 countries, and it's supported by 300 organizations. This week, I am delighted to welcome 5 women panelists. We have Julia Di Lisio from Argentina, Rosa Borg from Malta, Christina Ellingsen from Norway, Gaffney from Ireland, and Ruth Barrett from the USA. We're going to be focusing on self-ID because self-ID has progressed very far in the 4 countries of the 4 first speakers: Argentina, Malta, Norway, and Ireland. And to round off the webinar, we're going to have a conversation chat with Ruth Barrett from the USA, who's the editor of the groundbreaking book, Female Erasure, to introduce Julia Di Lisio. She's an activist and researcher based in Argentina, and she's going to talk to you about the effects of self-ID in Argentina.
I started my presentation showing how the evolution of men happened in Argentina, going from gaucho to queer macho. And if you see, there's a very small question and the women. So we have the ID law since 2012. And before I answer to the question, when and how was this law enacted in my country, I would like to give you like a brief context about Argentina, which is a very unequal country. I said that in the past years, it went from a macho culture to a queer macho one, because with this law, they tried to hide all the negative things about the macho culture, like misogyny, under this glitter carpet, where men are glorified because they are not afraid to use makeup or clothes like dresses. In Argentina, the oppression of women is very strong, and it is also combined with class and color oppressions. The money and the power is concentrated in the big cities, mainly Buenos Aires. And in the rest of the country, people are more isolated. This means that they have less to say in politics. To illustrate this, 40 to 60% of the population live in poverty or extreme poverty in Argentina. The self-ID law was approved on May 2012. I would also suggest that there is a similarity with the Irish case, because in 2010, similar proposals for the ID law were presented together with the matrimonio igualitario, which is the same-sex marriage. This law was presented by the center-left Christina Kirchner party. You can see her on the picture also giving out the new IDs for these autogynephilic men. And although in reality it is a very neoliberal party, but also the only party that achieves to structure some kind of social system to support the big poor population. This creates a recurrent circle where people need to stick to this party because there's no other option for them. There is extreme political fanatism that can only be challenged by the right wing and conservatives. The law was introduced in the most deceitful way, as we know it happens all the time, and it was supported also by the NGO called GATE, which was created in 2009, but the same NGO is the one organized in Spain, for example, to go very openly against radical feminists and women's movements. Since Argentina was the first country to introduce such a law in the world, it was very hard to imagine the magnitude of the harm it could cause as well. So what effects of self-ID have I seen on women's and girls' rights and spaces? So here I collected a couple of pictures where you can see that it's mainly about men. The pictures with Spanish words are publicity from the government pushing for prostitution, but I will get back to that in a moment. So since the self-ID law has been enacted in the countries like Canada, Sweden, and Argentina, the femicide rates result in 3 times higher than in the countries with similar structures or qualities without these laws. The state has programs to indoctrinate the population, from the media and the newspapers to infiltrating in universities, but also they arrange visits to companies to give talks about the gender ideology, how inclusivity should be, and what we should do to comply with the ID law. There is a regulation institution called INADI. They were created to act on discrimination, but now they are mainly focusing on misgendering cases. But INADI seems not to have anything to say about the lesbians being erased from the LGBT spaces. Lesbians are totally silenced, and the only way for them to exist or to even be accepted in the society is to adopt a male gender identity. The LGBT community is mainly about drag queens and gays or any other man with different gender identities. They keep using LGBT, but in reality should be only GT, since lesbians are not even shown anywhere. These men from the GT are also pushing for spaces like toilets without gender. For this reason, the construction companies in Argentina, like architects, added to their specialties multi-gender toilets for public places like universities and malls. I get a lot of emails from women telling me that they have to create secret accounts to follow radical feminist accounts like mine, where I show very raw content about different cases of autogynephilia. And this made it very clear to me that women in Argentina are living in a de facto totalitarian gender ideology regime, where saying anything different than the gender ideology can make them lose their jobs, their friends, turn them into a social pariah. So here in this photo, what I'm trying to show is this is like a regular ads about women, let's say, yeah, women's underwear, where you see in the center of the photo, there are 3 men with the red circles. You can imagine what I mean with this photo, but the reason I want to show this photo to you is because you see on the side, the other photo, the man is very close to the woman with his genitals. So you have to imagine someone getting finally a job to be photographed, and then you get to the set, and then this is what you find, right? You have to be smiling while you have the male genitals close to you, or even thrusting you or touching you, etc. Since the ID law has been pushed by the same current government years ago, they have been focusing always on the next points of the neoliberal gender agenda. And what is currently happening is that prostitution is being publicized on the Open TV channel that belongs to the state called TV Pública. This is happening while Argentina is an abolitionist country since 1936. They made TV spots and big campaigns to promote the legalization of prostitution. They are in the photos. For example, you can see how they are modifying the flag to add the red umbrella. And what you see on the other corner of the photo is AMAR, which is the organization pushing for prostitution very aggressively in Argentina. What you can also see in the black and white pictures is that 80% of these people pushing for prostitution in Argentina are men dressed as women. Then comes Fundación Huésped, which is another ally in this agenda against women. They used to be a foundation to fight against AIDS, and now they are a fully functional branch office of the gender politic lobby. They offer hormone treatments with misleading information. They manage and coordinate the different surgeries, and they also assist minors in case their parents oppose to the transition. They connect the minors with dedicated lawyers so the minor could access to the transition in despite of the parents' opposition. Like it happened in other countries, The AIDS Foundation is also linked with the surrogacy agenda. They have lobbyists pushing especially for these laws in different world organizations. And what is interesting to find is that they claim to have a feminist dedicated lobbyist that happens to be actually a gay man pushing for more rights for men to access to women's reproductive capacities. And there you can see him. Dumiso is a feminist human rights defender. So their link with the prostitution lobby is because, like in Uruguay, the Argentinian government wants to have prostitution regulated and that the women being exploited would be controlled by the AIDS Foundation by a sanitary booklet where clients and pimps could see that these women are healthy. Fundación Huésped receives investment from the European Bank, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, National Institute of Health from the US, the World Bank, among others. Here you can see the femicides rates for 2019, how the government, this is the official, how the government presented this. So it's not a flyer about some party, it's not a flyer about some LGTB celebration, are the numbers of women being killed. So I wanted to show you exactly how it looks. So I have a feeling that there is a big intention in minimizing how bad this is for women in Argentina. Then what happens with the statistics in self-ID? Between 2013 and 2018, over 500,000 cases of violence against women were reported. Between 2013 and 2019, there were 2,749 femicides. That makes 459 women per year being murdered. That is more than one woman per day. In a population of between 42 and 44 million, it is almost 0.1% of the total population of a country. And this law represents a big issue for the analysis of crimes and prevention, because if we mix the crimes committed by men and women, it will make it harder to prevent them and solve them. For example, 98% of the psychopaths turn out to be men, and 80% of the crimes are committed by men. The fact of not being able to have the correct information about who is committing the crimes makes it harder to try to prevent them and protect the society. In Argentina, there is very little or almost no information about what happens with women, for example, sharing jails with men identified as women. We get news from time to time from very small papers or online portals, but not more. The Ministry of Interior does not distinguish between women and men that have a female identity document. So like in Canada, it is really hard to hear about these cases and to follow up on the safety of the women in jails. The last report of the National Prison Attorney from 2018 starts dividing the prisoners into cis women, trans and lesbians, but later on, all the information is mixed and they name women to refer to men as well. We used to have a ministry dedicated to the violence against women, but since the law, it turned into the Ministry of Diversity and a bunch of other identities, as you can see in the photo. So the focus at the moment of this entity is to help travestites to have children, and they show them as mothers. They also interview them to gaslight the society into accepting this. The gays buying babies through surrogacy are much more accepted and even celebrated in the society than single mothers. Here you can see the spot of this travestite. It has been shown by the ministry as something positive, that he's a mother and that motherhood doesn't affect him much in his daily life. We know why. So then coming to the next question, what is happening with children and this law? And yes, there is indoctrination everywhere and in every layer of a society. There are campaigns from the government to push for this agenda in different formats, like going to schools to have talks with the students. This does not only apply to minors, but also teenagers starting university. There is a law called ESI that was designed to help schools and teachers with the sex education or sexual education, especially because due to the religion and the society being so conservative, the sex education was null or very poor. They also took the chance to infiltrate the trans agenda using this law as well. I have the feeling that kids do not really have a free choice to express themselves or choose what they want to be in life. And to the last question, who opposes this whole thing in Argentina? I want you to know that being in opposition to this law is being compared to being on the side of the military coup of 1976, where they kidnapped, killed and disappeared 30,000 people during the Operation Condor, where they stole the children of the prisoners and gave them to different families. This is a very fresh event in the Argentinian memory, since we are still looking for those kids that now are grown-ups. Although over 200 kids were given their real identity back, thanks to the Madres y Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, that stands for Mothers and Grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, these women got their children disappeared, desaparecidos. When their families would go to claim for them to the police, they were told that their sons and daughters were not dead, nor in jail, they were just disappeared with no identity, that they could not do anything else. And in the middle of the military coup, surrounded by extreme fear and in curfews, the mothers and the grandmothers of the disappeared students started walking calmly in circles once a week, right in front of the Casa Rosada, which is the government's house. They wore white handkerchiefs over their heads, and they just kept on walking in circles every week in peace until they became a force. The government that was on these women's side later on was the same one presenting the self-ID law. This is why it's so hard to go against this, because this government is the one that pushed for this law of identity. They mix this kind of lost children or robbed children with the identity. For this reason, this party is considered the Human Rights Party, since it was the only party that faced the militaries and took them to court. In terms of feminism, it is completely infiltrated and taken. In the feminist assemblies, men can't be denied to participate, even though there were some episodes where these men harmed and pushed and punched and pushed the women. So this is roughly the situation in Argentina.
Now we're going to go to Rosa Borg, and she's from Malta. She's a poet and activist. And thank you so much for coming, Rosa. You're the first woman that we've heard from Malta, and as many people know, Malta is at the forefront of the transgender ideology and movement. So my first question for you, Rosa, is when and how was legal self-ID of gender enacted in your country? Which groups pushed it forward, and were any alternatives proposed?
As you know, we haven't much chance to present opposing views to what is going on, so I really appreciate this as well. Malta is an extremely polarized country politically. We're bipartisan, basically. And after the elections of 2013, in April 2014, gender identity became a protected category in our constitution. Thanks to the Gender Identity and Gender Expression and Sex Characteristics Act of 2015, people can change their gender identity without having surgery or hormones, or even proving that they've been living as the opposite sex. They just sign a declaration and a note of registration in front of a notary. And that's it, basically. Those under 16 require parental consent. The newly elected party in government, the Labour Party, which came into power in 2013, was the main one who was instrumental in pushing this forward. And it did so with the complicity of state-captured LGBTQI, the whole alphabet soup organizations. Since this was enacted at around the same time as the Civil Unions Act of 2014, the objections mainly made by the Catholic Church and more conservative elements focused on civil unions and especially on adoption by same-sex couples rather than this. So they paused it when we weren't looking, basically.
The second question is, what effects have self-ID had on women's and girls' rights and spaces, etc.?
Well, women's spaces are now basically open to anyone who calls himself a woman. With regards to politics, we're seeing the first trans-identified, or rather, because I'm trying to stop using that phrase, those who have had surgery or hormones and think they are women, they're contesting local elections and MEP elections. But in the meantime, hate and violence against women is rife. Maltese investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated in 2017. First, they tried to shut her up in more conventional ways, basically, then they blew her up in a car bomb. Activists calling for justice. We've been doxxed, verbally and physically attacked, harassed. A government consultant compared protesters for justice to prostitutes. A female MP was threatened by another MP who said he'd come for her, and this was in Parliament. He said he'd come for her and split her open, and he was subsequently given a medal. Out of 67 MPs, only 9 of them are women, which is not surprising given the circumstances. And both MPs from both sides of the House, they're criticized on the basis of their sex rather than, what their work and what they're doing. Meanwhile, abortion remains illegal. The pay gap between men and women is still about 15% per month. Recently, we had a government spokesperson who called for women who are popular and not pretentious to contest elections and thus solve this imbalance between men and women in parliament. The proposed gender quotas bill, which is supposed to address this issue, excludes third parties, which means that those who don't have the financial backing of the two main parties won't make it, irrespective of quotas and their sex and whatever. The latest review report also shows that there is a lot to be done, even though on paper it looks good. There's a lot to be done to address gender violence. And we've also seen a surge of hate crimes with regards to men who identify as women. So it really doesn't benefit anyone, not even those that it's supposed to benefit, and especially not women. Lesbian and bisexual women are particularly vulnerable to this, both because of the amount of young girls who are being encouraged to have surgery or take hormones and other drugs, who then turn out to be either lesbian or bi, and also because the organizations which are supposed to represent us are mainly focusing on trans and intersex rights. They're parroting Stonewall and similar organizations. It's all about the T, basically.
What's happened about national statistics since gender self-ID in Malta?
Well, as far as we can tell, the number of women using the services of the gender clinic, there's basically one gender clinic in the main hospital. So it takes referrals from all over Malta. As far as we know, the number of young women being referred is 4 times as much. It's quadrupled. I say as far as we know because the availability of statistics is not good. It's sporadic. Last year's statistics, they still haven't been published in full, but I'm not holding my breath about it because from what I've heard from people who regret taking having surgery and taking hormones, like they were referred after 2 appointments and a couple of emails. I think we're in for a shock that there's a lot of young women who are going through this.
Who opposes self-ID in your country, Rosa? And have any of these groups surfaced recently? So have you got new groups forming, or have you got old groups that oppose self-ID, if any?
Mainly it's the more conservative elements who are opposing self-ID and objecting. In Malta, misgendering is a hate crime. It's you can be fined and taken to court and prison for it. So most people are afraid to speak up, and also there are people for whom it's not financially convenient to speak up. The latest law, which allows parents to leave their children's sex undeclared on their birth certificate, mixes up sex and gender. And this seems to have waken up at least members of the opposition who have objected to this, which is really good to see. Even though they're conservative, it's like at least somebody is realizing what is happening, and they're starting to pay more attention. There are also people who regret taking surgery and hormones, and they're starting to speak up as well. One of them was threatened with a court case just because she said that sex cannot change. And unfortunately, there are also a few extremists who are not against gender ID specifically, but against the whole LGBT community, who are homophobic, basically. Most feminists here are dealing with other issues. Abortion is illegal, so you have a lot of young women who are trying to get an abortion law passed, and there's also a lot of good work being done with regards to domestic violence. So there isn't really so much opposition to this.
What about children? What's happening with children and young people in schools? Are they being encouraged to transition?
Yes, they're being indoctrinated from a very young age. The focus is on identity, on how you feel, rather than sex and sexual orientation. It's prevalent right through from primary school to so-called inclusive language at university level, even with migrants. And it's being pushed by, of course, it's a state policy, but it's also being pushed by LGBTQI organizations. One issue of concern is the newly proposed EU equality strategy, which does have some good points with regards to, for example, disabled women and migrant women, but it also focuses on gender rather than sex. For example, it speaks of same gender couples rather than same sex couples. It's about the erasure of sex, and it's worrying because previously we've been able to appeal any local decisions on an EU level. And now we won't be able to do that. If there's a decision taken in court, we won't be able to appeal that. And I also find it very difficult to imagine how, we're going to decriminalize prostitution. How can a strategy which is supposed to improve women's rights be effective in a country which is decriminalizing prostitution? It doesn't make sense.
What peak transed you?
I don't think there was a specific issue. It was gradual. I had been reading about this, and watching from the sidelines, educating myself as they tell us to do. And what finally peak trans me was the language, the misogyny and the violent hatred, especially given what we have already been through here as a country with Daphne Caruana Galizia and everything. The hatred that we see directed towards women for speaking the truth, for saying that sex is real, for simply stating, for example, that only women have a cervix. Since then, it's been a whole series of big trans movements. From seeing lesbians being told they're transphobic just for being exclusively attracted to women and that they must include men, seeing mothers being referred to as pregnant people, little boys being told they're girls because they like glitter and they like pink, learning about trans widows and how they make a parody of us, of women, about how rape survivors do not have a right to choose female healthcare professionals because goodness forbid we stop centering men. We've had, recently we've had a so-called feminist library which excludes women who voice their concerns about women's rights, politicians, celebrities, and even certain feminists who believe that there are NATO women and women, when in truth we know that there's just women and we are not a subset over sex. There's allies who then say that there is no debate, so-called allies. And all in the meantime, there are women and young people who are being butchered and becoming dependent on pharmaceuticals for life. It does not stop, and we won't stop either.
We're now going to Christina Ellingsen. She's from Norway. She's a feminist activist. She's the Women's Human Rights Campaign country contact for Norway, and she's going to talk to us about self-ID and what's happening in Norway. Over to you, Christina.
It's just completely insane, like how feminist organizations believe that they are promoting, like are protecting, well, when they are. It's insane that people think that this blatant attack and erasure of women's rights, literal erasure of women's rights, somehow have anything to do with feminism. It's insane. The other day we had the 8th of March, the International Women's Day meeting, and all the pimps came with all their groomed little teenagers, and they're trying to insist that women's activism should be used to promote the rights of pimps. It's insane. It's insane. So it's just very interesting to see how it's the same kind of pattern repeating everywhere. They're doing this. It's a men's rights activism, and there's no other way to see it. Gender identity, the legal self-ID of sex was introduced in Norway in 2016. The law was passed by stealth after having been attached to a more popular reform by targeting youth and by avoiding excessive media coverage in order to give the campaign a protective veil, as it is described and detailed in the controversial lobby manual, Only Adults, Gender Identity Recognition for Youth. The techniques used in Norway, which appear shockingly undemocratic, and the case of manufactured consent. To those of us who are looking for the reports, well, I've been looking for so how did they manage to pass these laws when we have signed the UN Convention for Women's Human Rights? It's that those laws are explicitly detailing discrimination on the basis of sex. So I was looking for obviously there should have been a report detailing the potential conflicts. I just took it for granted that obviously those reports would be there. So I went looking for them, and there's no reports because they literally never did any report for that. They never made any assessment for that. Instead, what we find is the closest thing I found for an assessment is the University of Oslo Legal Department for studies there. The professor there made an anthology, which is detailing the opposite. It's detailing how they can amend the UN Convention for Women's for the elimination of all forms of violence and discrimination against women. How they can amend it to make it more inclusive to males who identify as women. It's insane. Okay, anyway. So the way the law was passed in Norway is listed as exemplary and is promoted as best practice in the manual, Only Adults, which is published by the International Gay and Lesbian Youth Organization. In any case, women's rights and the UN Women's Declaration are only mentioned once in the earliest document, and then only to serve the purpose of showing what kind of human rights framework LGBT peoples lack. And I'm saying peoples because they're increasingly presenting trans as if it's a separate type of human being, like it's some kind of a indigenous people who's kind of been hidden from view, and it's about giving rights. It's the way they're talking about it. It's like this combination of indigenous people's rights and, of course, the gay rights, even though they are in complete contradiction to both. The proposal for the law relied heavily on the Yoga Carta principles, and then it's very interesting to see there's one recommendation which is repeatedly used throughout the first proposal. That is a recommendation by the European Human Rights Council. It was supposed to list up factors that contribute to discrimination. So it kind of just lists up recommendations to all the usual factors, race, sex, nationality. But then they have one category called other issues, and that category is dedicated to gender identity. And on that basis, they have repeatedly then pushed to say that the EU has recommended that we change the definition of sex and that we include gender identity in our sex-based legal systems in Norway. I just think that's stunning. It's just so fascinating.
Christina, you mentioned, and I think you were sort of alluding to that there was a recommendation that came from the European Union that suggested some of this. Can you tell us when that was, and maybe explain to women what that recommendation? I think you've just mentioned it, but tell us, explain it.
Yes. Well, the first recommendation, from what I've gathered here, the Yoga Carta principles were sketched out in 2008. But those are not recognized as human rights instruments, and it's very, very controversial. It includes chapters that are illegal in many countries. And I'm not talking about same-sex attraction and practice, but like they are saying surrogacy should be available without discrimination, and they're talking about the need to remove sex language in terms of parenthood. Removing the word mother and removing the word father. Though the Yoga Carta principles were initially not included anywhere because it's so controversial. But the EU recommendation, I think it is the 20th recommendation. It was published in 2010. And with that one category being included, then there was some kind of a official basis to take it to law, to take it through the political, the democratic process. And both the Yoga Carta principles and these first recommendations, they sketch out how it's possible to give gender identity legal recognition. And there's only two things that they can talk about. They can't talk about it in terms of women's rights, because obviously women's rights are based on sex, and what they're trying to do is the opposite. So they're looking at the children's rights. So they are very often referring to children's rights and the rights of the child in terms of the right of identity and the right of self-expression, they're trying to make it as if children are these autonomous beings who are being repressed by their parents, so they're using that a lot. They are only mentioning women's rights once in terms to kind of have a comparable kind of convention. So there's two things that are kind of repeated in all this legislation I've been looking at, and that is about promoting women's rights, and then it's about this redefinition of sex to make sex more inclusive to males. And that's basically all. That's what we're seeing being played out. Like last week, a couple of weeks ago, the new child law was published in Norway, and they make it explicit that they are going to remove all the sex language describing parenthood. They are going to do it, just like they say in the Yoga Carta principles. They didn't manage to do it this time, but you get the impression that they're going to try their best next time. But this time they did decide to remove the word woman because to be more inclusive of people who give birth who don't identify as women. It's just insane. Basically, which is a combination of those two principles that they're just repeating, which is to change the definition of sex and to use children as an excuse to do it, and also gay rights consistently about gay rights.
Christina, how about the resistance in Norway, the sort of work you're doing and the work other women are doing? How's that going?
I think it's interesting to see who are opposed to, I wouldn't say gender ideology, because most people have no clue. They think they are supporting gay rights, some kind of variation of gay rights. And obviously it's not. It's a very radical redefinition of what it means to be human in the human rights and in our legal systems. But the opposition, they start off, when you go through the democratic papers, where they try to get people to write in and give their opinion, and they hear with experts, they all start off very supportive, and then as the hearings go on and there's more laws coming they have to answer, they start to get more and more critical. So for instance, the Norwegian Union for Doctors were very positive to the notion of self-idea. They were just a little bit critical to the way it was described as being easy to kind of change back and forth and kind of change the name back and forth. So they made a note that maybe it's a good idea to kind of keep it strict and not give the intention you can just change your name, your sex back and forth, because that's not possible. And they also mentioned that maybe we should not let children under 16 change their legal sex, because children don't really know what sex is. Plenty of these kind of concerns have become more explicit. So one of the more recent I read from them, they're saying, actually, no, we cannot decentralize the medical treatment of gender dysphoria. The treatment is potentially mutilating and irreversible, and it has to be diagnosed and treated at specialist centers. But they started off being very, oh yeah, of course, let's just all be friends and inclusive, and then a little bit sort of like this, and then finally going, actually no, it seems like this is very, very serious. We're talking about the most dramatic changes, irreversible changes we can do to a human body and do to children, who are the healthiest bodies on the planet. But other organizations who have criticized, who kind of everybody's voiced criticism on some level here. Even the trans organizations have voiced criticism about how these laws are being implemented, because they are irresponsible. Most recently, or most worryingly, is that the National Health Information Institutes, in combination with the National Treatment Facility for Gender Dysphoria, they went out and said directly that the new medical guidelines are in breach with the health laws, and that it includes potentially devastating recommendations. But they just wanted to have it documented that they say no. And also the trans organization I mentioned, they've been consistently, because the oldest trans organization in Norway. It's a very small organization, and it's been around for years. They immediately said there's no consequence, there's no review here of the consequences of the changes to self-ID. We are concerned for our demographic, and we need to have a consequential review for what the potential dangers can be for our demographic. And then they never got it. And then they kept on saying, we can't just let desperate people change their sex. That's, they've been saying that continuously. And then finally, this summer, they went out and said the entire process for their medical guidelines has been like a commissioned work. Like it's all been just like for show. Like they obviously just already decided what they wanted to achieve, and then the process to get there in terms of the decentralization of the treatment. They went out and just said this is dangerous to our demographic, and I know this is very ironic in a sense, because it is trans activists are the ones who are shouting the most and who have dedicated entire careers, you know, to kind of push forward this deregulation of the medical treatment, and also of how sex is defined in law. But there are, but this is incredibly hurtful for trans people. Or I mean, it's also very hurtful to the demographic that they're trying to protect, because it is not possible to change sex. And if you're going to treat a population, a demographic that believes that this is possible, it's insane to lie to them and say that that's possible, and then to deregulate how they access all this treatment. So that's also one group, just one notable group that has been consistently ignored, and also who have consistently raised concern. Then, of course, it's also the Christian groups, and their motivation has been with the concern of how families are registered in law, because they initially were concerned with the same-sex marriages and with the same-sex adoption and adoption rights, because they, you know, it was about how families are defined in law and how families are presented in schools. And of course, being like religiously motivated, their descriptions are usually, you know, more, less diplomatic. But their concerns has been the same continuously. It's about, well, how do we ensure that families are registered in our history, you know, like in our legal paperwork as being parents, like, and being how our mothers defined as mothers and how our fathers defined as fathers. This is their concern, because children should only come from a husband and wife. And apart from, so actually there is a lot of different organizations who have been criticizing this law, but they are all ignored.
We're going to move on now to Christine Gaffney. She's from Ireland. She's from LGB Alliance Ireland, and she's going to talk to us about what's happening on LGB Ireland's formation, work in progress, majoring on lesbo homophobia and human rights, and with some mention of self-ID. So thank you so much, Christine, and over to you.
So I suppose just a little bit about LGB Alliance Ireland. Of course, the forerunner to this was LGB Alliance that was formed in the UK, and they have had sister organisations setting up all over the world. And I had gotten involved in some groups who were, you know, we had come together concerned about defending women's rights, concerned about the impacts that the gender ID legislation had here. And so through that, then we were approached to see if there might be some people might be interested in setting up an Irish group, and that is what we did. So that was last October, and really we set up a Twitter account. And from the very beginning, there was a very negative pushback. Of course, different feminists who had publicly spoken out against gender ID legislation that had happened here, you know, were dismissed in so many of those misogynistic ways that they are dismissed. And I think that it was seen that an LGB group was seen as a bit more threatening to the status quo. They were just a bunch of bigots who were objecting to the self-ID. So we started off a Twitter account, and from the very beginning we were getting death threats, racist accusations. We were accused of being a British organisation, that we were all English, which, you know, if you know the history of the sometimes fraught history between England and Ireland, you will realise that was intended to carry a lot of weight. So there was that kind of demonisation of us. And there was a number of articles appeared in Gay Community News, for example. We were mentioned in Pink News. Very negative. And then that kind of culminated in an article in the Irish Independent. Now, the Irish Independent would be the most popular and widely read and sold newspaper in the country. So basically, there was a nasty hit piece full of the usual accusations of transphobia, etc. And we asked for right of reply, and we got right of reply. And so we put in an article explaining where we were coming from, what our ambitions are. And of course, our ambitions are really to defend lesbian, gay and bisexual rights. The problem is, as I'm sure everybody here watching will know, that organisations like Stonewall and other LGBT organisations have in fact stopped representing lesbians, gays and bisexuals at all. It's all about the T, and frankly they've come out with what can only be described as homophobic policies. So this is kind of a thing that's been happening under the radar. The great big umbrella has, the great big rainbow umbrella has spread so wide that basically anybody can shelter in under it these days. So we had the article in, our response was published in the Irish Independent in November. Well, there was a ferocious pushback from that because, of course, an awful lot of the discussion that goes on around gender ID and the negative impacts that has had really takes place on the margins. It happens on Twitter. It's not really happening in the mainstream. And of course, this is part of the agenda. It's in the same ways I know we've heard about the discussion about how gender ID was sneaked in other countries. This happened in Ireland too. In 2015, we had a referendum. People voted for same-sex marriage. That legislation was brought in, and at the same time, gender ID legislation was sneaked in as well. So there had been some discussion about it, but the government advisory book back in the group back in 2012 had advised that when we were going to bring in legislation to allow people to legally change their sex, because of course, as we know, they can't actually change their sex in reality, but we were going to, and of course, protect them from discrimination. I don't think anybody should be discriminated against on the basis of how they look or how they dress. I think that is a human rights issue. But having said that, there was supposed to be medical gatekeeping, and that had been the recommendation. The recommendation had been there must be medical gatekeeping. There must be actually having lived as the opposite sex, with an absolutely expressed intention to live as the opposite sex for the rest of your life. So there were supposed to be safeguards around that. And then very deviously, that was changed. Again, the influence of the Yoga Carta principles and certain people who pushed that specific agenda. So basically, self-ID was sneaked in. People didn't realise what they were voting for. I think genuinely the politicians didn't realise what they were voting for, didn't realise the implication. And much as it has happened in other countries, so for example, Denton's legal firm talks about Ireland as being an exemplar of how this should be approached in any country. You hide what you're doing with self-ID under some other more positive progressive legislation, such as same-sex marriage, and that's exactly what happened here too. So back to the story. So we had our article published in the Irish Independent, and there was a huge pushback from that. We also contacted schools, because there's a group belongs to here who go into schools and they teach about diversity and rainbow families, but pretty much like so many other organizations, they have just really focused on the gender extremist ideology, to the extent that even though they're going in and they talk about homosexuality, they talk about gays, they talk about lesbians, but in fact they've redefined us as well. No longer is it a sex-based identity, it's not sex-based attraction, they're slipping in gender, they're talking about mostly attracted to. So that kind of devious sleight of hand with language has been happening as well. And well, of course, we want children to understand, that not every family is heterosexual, mammy, daddy, that there are different family forms, that, life isn't necessarily, everybody isn't heterosexual, etc. At the same time, there's definitely an underlying message there that is being given to children that they too might be, trapped in the wrong body. There is this kind of a homogenization of lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans, as if there is no difference in experience, no difference in biology, no difference in the history, no difference in the implications. So that is a disturbing thing that is happening in schools too. So we did write to the schools to ask them to reconsider the material, because of course there was also a difference, again, part of the agenda. There was a difference in materials, what was being given to teachers, what was being publicly said was the material that was being directed at students. So there's all that kind of a conflation of a lot of different issues going on. And this is really very problematic. And of course, the thing is, in a way, we stopped teaching a long time ago the feminist difference between what sex is about, the difference about biological discrimination based on your biology, and the roles that you are expected to perform in life, what we call gender, on the basis of the body you come into this world with. So, so people often don't necessarily realize the implications of what it is that they're actually teaching. So then between the combination of us having had the publicity in the Irish Independent, our contact with schools, next thing we saw was a petition in the Gay Community News signed by Amnesty International, signed by the National Women's Council of Ireland, signed by different groups that portrayed themselves as representing the interests of lesbians, of gay men, and of LGBT people more generally, all signed this letter, basically asking for us to be deprived of our human rights. They asked for us, they wanted us to be deprived of our right to political representation. That is a human right. They asked for basically for the removal of our right to free speech. That's a human right too. So, and this was that they wrote this awful letter and then signed it. All these people signed it, individuals as well as organizations. Was absolutely simply appalling. I mean, it was shocking. It was absolutely so shocking. Now, of course, they didn't name us in person, but it was absolutely clear who was being directed against. Now, I will say that, of course, there are other feminist organizations as well, and definitely they were getting the slap of the brush as well. So, for example, Radical Colony, they're another group. They have a presence on the web, and they do have excellent work, excellent information. Actually, I must share their site with them. It's a very good resource, particularly to direct maybe young people out who just want to kind of like find out a bit more. So it's a radical feminist site. Really accessible, nice, colourful, very attractive. And there's another group, the Countess, that they also had gained some public traction as well. And so there were a few different feminist groups who had gained public notice, but definitely it was a group representing LGBT people, I think, was definitely seen as a real threat to the narrative that it was only bigots who were protesting. So this really generated quite a bit of interest. There were articles about it in like The Spectator. There were articles about it, a lot of interest on Twitter, some interest in the British media about it. A letter into the Irish Times from Isolde White, who was the granddaughter of the founding member of Amnesty International, Sean McBride. So, and she, of course, was appalled at basically a human rights organization calling for the removal of human rights from lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and women in general. So that was a really shocking development. So since then, really, we've been keeping up. We've been in contact with our TDs and senators. There was a proposal, an early proposal for hate crime legislation, which we got in contact with, and that kind of failed. But now the government, this is the next big fight that we have on our hands, is that they're planning on bringing in hate crime legislation into Ireland. And the way that now the actual legislation itself hasn't seen light of day yet, but the document that they have disseminated to the public to inform them about what's going to be in it is absolutely filled with protections for trans-identified people, and sex, as a characteristic that might need any kind of protection, is mentioned once in a heading for a section, but then it's actually collapsed and disappears into gender within the section itself. So, and in Ireland is particularly precarious because our laws don't specify sex as a protected characteristic. It specifies gender instead. So I think that's really kind of all I can say for the moment. Really, I see my time has come up at this stage. So hopefully I've covered all the bases that I intended to. There's one tiny little last word. Yesterday, Lauren, as well as from our group, as well as Stella O'Malley and a detransitioner Carol and Dr. Ashley were on the gay spot. And so if anybody wants to tune into that, they were discussing dysphoria. So just wanted to say that. Thank you.
So we're now going to talk to Ruth Barrett. Ruth Barrett is the editor of Female Erasure, which was published in 2016. And it's this book here. Look how it's very, very big. There's a lot of pages in it. Now, many of you will have already read it. 551 pages, and it's got sort of 30 or 40 different pieces by different women. It's incredibly brilliant. It's an overview from 2015, but I guess, Ruth, you wrote it or edited it in 2015. So, Ruth, the first question I have: what made you write? What got you to write or edit Female Erasure?
The thing about how I got interested in needing or felt compelled to do this is because I've been dealing with this issue since the late 1980s. This is not a new issue. I am part of a spiritual tradition that is female-centered and female-only. It's a branch of Wiccan religion, which is feminist witchcraft, that came out of second-wave feminism. And our tradition has always been women only, and it came out of second wave feminism when women began to gather in CR groups, in consciousness raising groups, and there was a lot of research happening around women's history that had been, of course, not taught to any of us, our long history of what happened before patriarchy actually existed. And so there were a lot of social movements that converged, including the women's liberation movement, what was called the gay liberation movement, the ecology movement. Many social movements that converged that gave rise to this. The truth is, women have always gathered separately from males for specific rights around our bodies. I mean, that's always been long before there was a feminist movement. So what happened was there was a revival in the late 1960s into the early 1970s, where it had a new context to emerge, and that it was not only to be a solution to female self-hatred and body hatred, but also to heal from the context in which we live, which is patriarchy. It was a convergence of those things that were the goals of this. And we call this tradition Dianic, after the Roman goddess Diana, but her Artemis is really the Greek goddess who preceded Diana, is really more the name giver. And it has to do with female sovereignty. So I've been involved with feminism and its impact and how we can empower and heal for myself about 45 years. And the the issue basically came to my door because we've always had to deal with, from the very beginning, men who were upset with us because we were female only. So dealing with that has always been from the beginning for 50 years this year. We're celebrating 50 years this year.
So Ruth, did you see an increasing number of men saying they were women over the last, say, 20 years? Did it really start impacting on your activities?
Thank you. Yes, it started I think it was in the very early 90s where it really started. It started, there was one man who wanted to take one of my classes, and this was, definitely had done the breasts, the nails, the all the things. And at that time, I let him into one beginning class, and it was, really early on. I knew this was a strange person. I had a feeling about it, but we weren't I would know it in 1 second now, okay? But at the time, it was very awkward. And I told him that I could no longer be his teacher because he was a guy. And basically the biggest, I guess, wake up thing for me was that he told me literally that he was a better woman than me because he had chosen to be a woman and I was born this way.
Wow, that's so terrible. And
I mean, yeah.
I mean, that's awful. And you were experiencing it very clearly quite a long time ago. What made you call the book Female Erasure? Because I remember when I got it, I thought, well, that's a bit extreme. I don't know if they're really going to try to actually erase females. And this was 2016 or whatever, but every year that goes past, I think it's so right, the title. But what
yes, I struggled with what to call the book. I met with a couple of women who had doctorates, one in religion and one in women's studies. And we had this discussion actually at a Parliament for the World's Religions back in 2015. And because originally I was going to call it something else that was not exactly, pressing the button. And there are people who have different ideas about, go for something more positive as opposed to something that has that. And I realized that this was what it was. It was what it was. And so I decided to just name it. And because it was, at the time I put this together, there was not, I was really trying to find women who would speak out from many different perspectives. It was very challenging. Those early interviews and early articles that were in the book, I mean, I had women who knew they would be fired if they used their real names. There were doctors and psychologists, and now, of course, it's what has happened since the publication of that book, and it was published actually in 2016. It's now there's a lot more out there, which is wonderful. I mean, it really truly has changed in that regard.
I must say, though, that I think whilst there is a lot out there, this is still, I mean, it stands the test of time. There's a lot of very core ideas in there, and there's articles from some of the important feminists, I think. And so definitely for women who haven't read it, I would recommend it is definitely worth still reading, getting now, even though it is a few years old. It's sort of, it hits the nail on the head. But what do you think? Did you think it was going to get this bad? Did you think in the last 5 years things would change so quickly and so far? Or has it been a surprise to you?
It's not been a surprise at all. I wish I could say I'm surprised. I'm horrified. Clearly, I'm horrified, and I think that the non-thinking to sign on to this is the most terrifying part. And of course, we're seeing these extremes on the far right and on the far left. And so I think when we talk about it as cult mentality, I believe that's true. And I think that the way that that has been successful, greatly successful, is because of the language. And I know a lot of us have talked about this, and I've certainly written about it, even in Female Erasure. And that's the concept of framing. The language that we use actually reveals the worldview of the speaker. And so we cannot use the language of the transgender lobby and their activists. When we do that, we enter their frame. We enter their world, and we need to use our language and stick to our language that reflects our point of view.
Yeah. And so I know some have spoken about this, but can you give us a couple of examples of that?
Well, exactly, like trans women, using trans-identified males is our frame. Theirs places a male in the category of woman.
Yeah. I mean, I quite like the way saying, if you say it's men who identify, so you put men first, so you hear the word men, that's really clear then, and it keeps yeah, okay, so that's a really good thing to use our language.
Yes, and I do want to recommend the work of George Lakoff. If you don't know about the work of George Lakoff, this is he's a cognitive scientist and linguist, and he's written a lot about how language is used to literally manipulate. I mean, this is why we're in this situation on so many levels. And one of the books he wrote called The Political Mind, and it was written before this issue, the trans issue is happening. But it literally, how you think changes how the brain matter. I'm talking about physicalizing. And so how to recognize the power of the words we choose to use cannot be understated.
Yeah. And so, Ruth, another thing, because you've thought about this and you had the foresight to say Female Erasure and call your book that, what do you think's going to happen next? Could you give us share some of your ideas about what you think is going to happen in the next, say, 5 years? Even if it's really bad.
Yes, well, one thing I do want to I have to remind myself, and I'll remind all of us, is that women's rights have never been in a straight line. There's been progress, and then there's been backlash. There's been progress and backlash. And you can look at this through history and culturally. And so it gives me hope that even though right now it's really, really bad, it's not looking like, anyone wants to listen to us. There are people who are listening to us, and there are more of us gathered. We have to look for the wins in the midst of the horror of this. We have to look also for the wins. And so I think that there will absolutely be a cycle of waking up. Unfortunately, there's a lot of collateral damage to our children and to our rights as women, to our sovereignty. And I also believe that it will cycle through. And I think that as the lawsuits begin with the medical establishment, with treating men as though they are female people biologically, just like we know that it wasn't until the 1990s in the United States that there were studies on women in women's health, actually on the female body, and the institutes of health all show sex matters.
Yeah.
Sex matters.
Thank you so much. And Ruth, we've just only got time for one more sort of question. What I'd be really interested in knowing is, what do you think we should do next?
Okay.
What should we do
Well,
about
the main thing is we need to keep speaking out. And I do want to mention one thing that I just did, and it may interest some of you to do. I watched the White House correspondent, the press briefings that are happening on television, and I just realized I could write to the White House Correspondents Association, and I did, and I told them to ask those questions, and I brought the WHRC declaration, and I sent it. I gave them the contact. I sent them that information. I think if more of us did that and have the reporters ask the questions of the press gal, and it's the White House, WHCA.press/contact. And that's White House Correspondents Association. You could have a reporter maybe ask the questions. And that's what I did about the Equality Act. And I basically...
That's great. And we can, if we had questions, we can ask journalists to ask them for us.
Exactly. It just was like one of those duh moments. And that's what I've done. And so, in other words, would the Biden administration consider a win-win solution that protects both natal females, and transgender, by including sex as a category for protections under the law? The last thing I want to mention too is I am actually helping a young woman named Elizabeth Miller publish a new anthology, and it's going to be coming out, I think, in March. It's called Spinning and Weaving: Radical Feminism for the 21st Century.